So I have this friend, right, senior engineer, one of the big AI labs out in California. And the other day, he's walking me through the numbers for his latest project.
Oh, yeah. The big ones.
Yeah, and the budget was just eye-watering. We're talking tens of millions just to start training the model.
Uh-huh. Sounds about right for the frontier stuff.
He talked about it like a general planning a war, the scramble for GPUs, the burn rate, this race to beat the competition. The whole conversation was just scale, 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 burning cash like fireworks. And he seemed pretty proud of it, the sheer size of it all.
It's become a badge of honor almost. The bigger the budget, the more serious you are, supposedly.
Exactly. Then I mentioned a different number, $294,000.
Okay.
He paused. What's that? He asks. A signing bonus.
If only.
No, I said. That's the entire training cost for DeepSeek R1, China's new world-class model.
What did he say?
He just went quiet because, $294,000, that wouldn't even cover his own salary for the year.
Wow.
And in that silence, you could just feel the whole narrative shifting, this assumption that the only way to win is to just outspend everyone. Poof. It just evaporated.
It really did. It's not about who has the biggest budget anymore, is it?
Not at all. It's about who's getting more intelligence for their dollar. And, that's a very different fight.
That silence you mentioned, that's the sound of a paradigm kind of collapsing in on itself. For years, the established wisdom, especially in Silicon Valley, right, was that the path to AI dominance was strictly financial.
Big money, big compute.
Exactly. Massive capital expenditure, billions in funding, hoarding the latest NVIDIA hardware, building these enormous data centers. It was all about competing purely on scale, brute force, the sheer volume of compute time.
And it felt like a closed game, didn't it? If you didn't have a nine-figure budget, you basically couldn't even play at the cutting edge.
Precisely. But DeepSeek, this AI startup, backed by the Chinese hedge fund Highflyer, they just introduced a fundamentally new metric into this whole global race. They proved that you can get performance parity with giants like Google or OpenAI for what amounts to, well, pocket change in the world of frontier AI.
The cost of entry just plummeted.
Absolutely. And that changes the calculus for every single nation, every company on Earth.
Okay, let's unpack this right away, because our mission today really is to figure out the how. We need to explore how China managed this achieving world-class AI models, technological leadership, not by matching Western spending, but by implementing this coordinated national strategy, leveraging a massive talent pool.
An unparalleled talent pool.
Right. And maybe most surprisingly, turning what were supposed to be crippling international constraints like those export restrictions into a powerful, almost structural advantage in cost-efficient intelligence production.
Yeah, we are absolutely seeing the rise of efficiency engineering as maybe the dominant competitive factor now. The new metric isn't just teraflops anymore. It's who's maximizing the intelligence output for every single dollar spent on compute.
So it's intelligence per dollar.
That's the game. DeepSeek's breakthrough. It signals a structural shift in the whole AI economy, one that accelerates the diffusion of advanced capabilities globally and, critically, fundamentally reduces the financial barriers to entry for newcomers, for existing challengers. The days when only, 3 companies could afford to build a leading model, those days are over.
So the era of bigger budget equals better model has given way to something like smartest engineering equals world-class performance.
You got it.
Okay, let's anchor this deep dive back to that specific economic shockwave. You have the figure, maybe $100 million, sometimes more, for the big U.S. models.
Minimum. Often.
Right. And then you have DeepSeek R1, trained for approximately $5.6 million. And then some reports, like we said, citing that astonishingly low figure of $294,000.
Yeah, even if you take the higher number of the $5.6 million, the disparity is it's not just a cost reduction. It's almost an indictment of the previous AI economics, isn't it?
It really is. It forces every major lab to look hard at their burn rate. I mean, when a model achieves performance parity with yours for less than 5% of the capital outlay,
you have to ask where the other 95% went.
Yeah.
Right. The initial reaction in the West, especially to that 294K figure, was, well, it was outright skepticism.
Sure, it must be subsidized, or it's just a small part of the model.
Exactly. They're not telling us the whole story.
But then the performance metrics were independently validated, and that skepticism pretty quickly turned into genuine concern. DeepSeek achieved its results because it was forced to innovate structurally, not just iteratively. They simply didn't have the option of relying on brute force computational power.
And this is where it gets really interesting, right? Turning constraints into actual innovation. The source material points out that DeepSeek's success is a direct, maybe unintended consequence of the U.S. export restrictions on those cutting-edge GPUs. The H100s, the A100s, the top-tier stuff.
Yeah, they just couldn't buy their way to the front of the line.
Exactly. And when you can't access the most powerful, most expensive, state-of-the-art hardware, what's left? The only path to competence is optimization. Deep optimization.
So they had to get smarter.
They had to. DeepSeek strategically leveraged older, more widely available GPUs, things like the NVIDIA H800 series chips that were specifically designed to fall just below those strict export control thresholds. So the constraint on hardware didn't stop them. It actually became the indispensable mother of invention. It pushed them toward these deep architectural breakthroughs that maximized every available cycle on the hardware they could get their hands on.
So this wasn't just about, gritty determination and working harder on older gear. It was a fundamental technological pivot, a complete architectural and software revolution, really.
Absolutely.
We hear about the mixture of experts or MOE architecture. Why is MOE like the secret weapon for these constrained compute environments?
Okay, MOE is fundamentally about two things: sparsity and specialization. Think of a massive traditional AI model, like a single, huge, sprawling corporate headquarters building.
Okay.
If you ask it a question, say, explain plate tectonics, everyone in the building gets the memo. The accountants, the cafeteria staff, everyone. It's incredibly inefficient.
Right. Lots of wasted effort.
Exactly. In MOE, though, you have a highly specialized team of, experts. Think of them as little specialist departments. When you ask about geology, only the geology expert and maybe the physics expert wake up and handle the query.
Ah, okay. So that significantly reduces the computational burden then. You're maybe activating only 10 or 20% of the neurons, but still getting, 90% or more of the performance?
Precisely. You're maximizing the available FLOPS, the floating point operations per second, because you're not wasting energy, not wasting compute on irrelevant calculations. Now, here's the tricky part, the technical difficulty that DeepSeek really cracked. Implementing MOE efficiently is incredibly complex, especially across a constrained network of less powerful GPUs. You have this thing called the routing problem. The model has to instantly and accurately decide which expert, or with few experts, get the query.
Okay.
And then crucially, the results from those few experts have to be quickly and efficiently communicated back through the network and synthesized into a coherent answer. This whole process requires extremely tight coordination and really rapid communication between all the individual GPUs acting as these experts.
And doing that successfully on older hardware, which probably has slower communication buses, less memory bandwidth?
That's the monumental engineering feat. They pulled it off.
Wow. Okay, so that explains the architectural genius. But DeepSeek didn't stop there, did they? They went way down into the weeds. The really low-level programming, this is the second mechanism, low-level optimization.
Yeah.
They weren't just writing code for the AI, they were writing code for the silicon itself. The sources mentioned DeepSeek engineers digging deep into NVIDIA's PTX language.
This is the really deep, hardcore technical work. This is what separates brilliant AI engineers from, genius systems engineers. PTX, parallel thread execution, it's essentially the assembly language for NVIDIA GPUs.
Like the machine code.
Pretty much the lowest level of programming you can get to. It dictates exactly how instructions are executed right on the hardware. Most AI labs, they work several layers above this. They rely on high-level software frameworks like PyTorch or TensorFlow. DeepSeek engineers, they bypassed all that abstraction.
But why? Why go to that painstaking, microscopic level of detail? It sounds incredibly difficult.
Because they had to. They needed to precisely fine-tune the interactions between the AI task and the actual GPU's capabilities. Their goal was essentially to hide latency.
Hide latency. What does that mean?
Latency is the time the GPU spends waiting for data to load from memory, waiting for a communication signal from another GPU in the network. Those compute cores are expensive, they're incredibly fast. If they're sitting idle, even for microseconds, you're wasting money and time.
Okay, so idle time is the enemy.
It's the killer in large-scale computing. So DeepSeek engineers meticulously scheduled compute tasks to execute simultaneously while data was being transmitted during that communication phase between GPUs.
So they were essentially overlapping the tasks. The GPU is calculating something while it's also preparing to receive the next batch of data, so those expensive cores never sit idle.
That's exactly it. It's the highest form of resource management you can imagine at that level. By managing these really complex interdependencies of multi-step reasoning processes, which usually demand enormous high-bandwidth compute at this fundamental PTX level, they could extract the absolute peak efficiency from those H800 GPUs.
Even though the H800s are technically less powerful than the chips the US banned?
Right. They manage these complex workloads despite using constrained hardware. It's just an incredible story of engineering defiance, really. They were told you can't have the H100, so they said, fine, we'll max out the H800. And they achieved performance parity anyway for potentially $294,000.
Just amazing. So they effectively squeezed maximum performance from constrained hardware through pure software wizardry. And that, as you said, fundamentally changes the global economic equation for AI.
Absolutely. It makes it accessible not just to a handful of billion-dollar companies, but potentially to thousands of smaller firms worldwide, startups, universities, national labs in other countries.
And that acceleration leads us straight into a classic economic dilemma, doesn't it? The Jevons paradox, but applied to AI.
Exactly. The Jevons paradox, which we know from the 19th century regarding coal efficiency, basically suggests that increasing the efficiency of using a resource often leads to an increase in its overall consumption, not a reduction.
Because it becomes cheaper and more useful, so people find more ways to use it.
Precisely. So if AI suddenly becomes dramatically cheaper and more accessible, if DeepSeek can train a world-class model for, let's say, $500,000 instead of $100 million, this increased efficiency might not actually reduce the overall global demand for compute hardware.
Instead, it could accelerate global adoption everywhere, driving more demand for cost-effective AI chips.
That's the potential outcome. The pressure isn't just on NVIDIA anymore to make the fastest chip. The whole semiconductor industry is now potentially scrambling to meet a newly democratized, massive global demand for efficient compute.
The barrier to entry just collapses.
It collapses. And for you, the listener, this means every single competitive industry, finance, logistics, manufacturing, pharma, you name it, will likely integrate AI faster and deeper than anyone previously modeled. Why? Because the operational cost of using these intelligent systems has just dropped off a cliff.
Which means rapid changes.
Rapid displacement in certain job sectors, absolutely. And it requires immediate large-scale workforce reskilling. AI capabilities are now democratized far beyond the incumbent giants. It gives startups and national rivals a much, much cheaper path to get into the innovation race. That $294,000 model budget, it's the ultimate game changer.
Okay, the DeepSeek story is just brilliant on a technical level. But like you said, it exists within this larger, deliberate national framework in China. We need to look beyond just the code and examine the strategic engine that's driving China's competitive edge. And that really starts with people, doesn't it? This unparalleled talent pool.
Yeah, if technological leadership is ultimately determined by the sheer quantity and quality of specialized human capital, then China holds a massive structural advantage here that honestly cannot be overstated. We see the numbers right. The STEM graduates every year, huge numbers. But it's the specific talent pool where the real power lies.
There was that quote from Tim Cook, Apple CEO, comparing chip manufacturing expertise.
That was a really powerful comparison. He said something like, if you gathered all the U.S. engineers with nanometer-level expertise, the kind of precision you need for modern chip making and advanced AI hardware design, they would barely fill a large conference room.
Wow, okay.
China, in contrast, he suggested, would need multiple stadiums to hold that same quantity of specialized human capital.
Multiple stadiums. That's what the source material calls a human superpower. And it's not accidental, is it? The state explicitly views talent as the first resource.
Absolutely not accidental. Our sources show this multi-pronged strategy to grow the STEM workforce. Improving domestic education dramatically, that's one part. Aggressively attracting overseas Chinese talent back home, that's another huge push. And also strategically attracting foreign talent with significant incentives.
It's holistic. It's not just about producing more graduates. It's about ensuring they pursue careers aligned with national strategic goals, right? Like advanced manufacturing, foundational AI.
Exactly. There was this example I read about, an engineer named Zhang Wei. She apparently chose a state-backed semiconductor research institute over a much higher-paying job in consumer tech.
Why?
Because she saw it as part of this national long march toward technological leadership. She spends these grueling 12-hour days optimizing microscopic processes, not primarily for personal financial glory, but because her personal success is explicitly linked to the country's collective strategic success.
That's a powerful motivator.
It's an incredibly powerful force. You have millions of highly skilled, highly motivated individuals all pulling in the same direction, guided and often funded by the state. That's the engine of their momentum.
And that collective focus feeds directly into the second point, the strategic engine itself, this coordinated industrial policy. The U.S. model relies so heavily on decentralized, private, short-term profit motives, venture capital demanding rapid scaling.
Quarterly returns, yeah.
Right. China contrasts this with a unified, state-backed vision driven by what's called state capitalism.
And what's fascinating here is how China seems to treat its major technological firms, not just as typical private companies subject to market whims, but almost as national infrastructure projects. They're largely immune to short-term market fluctuations.
Which allows individual ambition to align with national goals almost by design.
Pretty much. It's patient capital applied at a national scale.
Let's put some numbers to that patient capital, because we're talking about a level of support that just completely changes the risk equation for these huge long-term tech bets. They're not waiting for a quarterly earnings report to validate a 20-year project.
No, the scale is immense. Look at this. Over 99% of China's 5,260 listed firms receive direct government subsidies. That totaled $35.3 billion in just 2022.
35 billion euros.
And if you measure overall industrial support relative to the economy, China spent about 1.73% of its GDP on this in 2019. That was $221 billion. That is, relative to GDP, 3 to 4 times higher than major EU or OECD countries.
3 to 4 times higher.
Yeah. And for large industrial firms, the government support averages around 4.5% of their revenues in China. Compare that to just 0.69% in OECD countries. It's nearly 9 times greater.
The comparison is just stark. The Western model demands a high return in, 3 to 5 years? The Chinese model is structurally set up to handle maybe a decade of negative cash flow, as long as the project aligns with achieving national technological sovereignty.
And the investments are very specific, very targeted, and enormous. There are plans for state-backed VC funds, something like 1 trillion yuan, about 137.8 billion US dollars, specifically for robotics and AI, planned over 2 decades.
Wow.
Public spending on quantum research reached approximately $15 billion. That was 8 times the previous planned allocation in the U.S. at the time. This investment scale, combined with that military-civil fusion strategy.
Where civilian AI breakthroughs get instantly applied to military advancement.
Exactly. It creates this immense technological accelerator. You have PLA thinkers, for instance, anticipating how AI will reshape war itself, needing AI for data fusion, command decision support, intelligent autonomous systems, all fed by breakthroughs happening in the civilian sector, like potentially DeepSeek's efficiency gains.
That unified long-term purpose sounds incredibly effective, especially when you're facing external pressure. But it seems like it requires a very specific mindset from the individual engineer, the scientist, the worker. Which brings us to that third core advantage you hear about, the cultural edge. The concept of Chiku, eating bitterness.
Chiku. Yeah, it's this idea, forged by centuries of challenging history, really. It's this ingrained ability, almost a cultural willingness to endure personal hardship, deprivation, intense pressure, all in service of a greater collective or national goal.
The group over the self.
Fundamentally, it's a core belief where the group's success is prioritized over the self's immediate comfort or gain. And this collective mission, it creates immense resilience. It allows teams to innovate rapidly and efficiently, even with limited resources, exactly like DeepSeek did.
It sounds like the perfect cultural countermeasure to hardware sanctions in a way. If you can't buy your way out of a problem, you're culturally predisposed to just work your way out, no matter how painful or time-consuming it might be.
That's a good way to put it.
However, let's be frank here. The sources also hint at a potential downside. This high-pressure environment, potential for burnout, maybe a culture that sometimes prioritizes political alignment and stability over the kind of chaotic, radical, intellectual freedom that often fuels truly novel, disruptive innovation like you see in Silicon Valley. Doesn't that structural rigidity risk the long-term quality and originality of the talent pool?
That is a critical question, and it's definitely debated. But the structural defense, if you will, for the Chiku model, it's kind of twofold. First, the resilience it creates is a tangible strategic asset, especially when you're under geopolitical siege, like with chip sanctions.
Right.
Look at that small AI startup in Beijing we mentioned earlier. Similar situation to DeepSeek. Couldn't get the high-end GPUs.
Yeah.
The team leader reportedly told them, look, we don't have the best tools, so we have to be the smartest team. And then they just knuckled down and optimized their code relentlessly to run on the older chips they could get.
This forced innovation again. The high-pressure environment acts like a forge.
Exactly. It forced them to find efficiencies that Western teams, often swimming in abundant high-end hardware, might never even bother looking for. So the sanctions, intended to cripple them, ironically might have accelerated their optimization skills.
Okay, so that's one defense. What's the second?
The second is that the Chiku mindset enables the pursuit of technological goals that are simply too long-term for Western financial models driven by quarterly returns. Fusion energy is the ultimate example, maybe.
Decades away, huge investment needed.
Exactly. It takes decades to mature, demands vast, sustained investment with no immediate payoff in sight. When you have patient capital from the state and a culture willing to endure that short-term pain for a long-term national gain, you can sustain investment in state-backed initiatives like the China Fusion Energy Company. They launched with something like $2.1 billion in registered capital, pursuing projects that achieved breakthrough plasma temperatures recently. This ability to pursue a long march towards something like fusion or complete technological self-reliance is a significant structural competitive advantage derived directly from that cultural disposition.
Okay, let's pivot now to the ongoing chip war. Because of the technical constraints we just discussed, the mindset pivot, the lack of access to the best hardware, these weren't accidents. They were entirely deliberate actions by the U.S.
Oh, absolutely deliberate. The U.S. control strategy was explicitly designed to restrict China's access to advanced chips, and just as importantly, the manufacturing equipment needed to make them. Things like EUV and the more advanced EUV lithography systems, advanced logic chip.
The goal being?
The intent was pretty clear. Create an insurmountable technological choke point. Advanced semiconductors are the absolute bedrock of modern defense, modern industry, modern AI. By restricting access to the leading-edge chip-making tools and the most powerful computing chips, the U.S. aimed to slow the PLA's emergence as a peer competitor and, crucially, curb China's AI potential, especially given that military-civil fusion strategy.
It was a strategy based on the premise that cutting off the supply of the absolute best meant cutting off progress entirely.
Pretty much, yeah. Deny the ingredients, deny the final product.
But history often shows that export bans like this can provoke a really defiant strategic response. They often push the targeted nation towards indigenous development, right? And China's objectives seem to shift very quickly from just dealing with shortages to outright strategic defiance. The goal became remove dependency.
The response was fierce, it was targeted, and in certain areas, profoundly effective. The most significant achievement, the one that really shook the global industry, was that Huawei SMEC breakthrough.
With the smartphone chip.
Exactly. Despite Huawei being on the U.S. Entity List, facing severe restrictions on accessing tools and software, they released the Mate 60 smartphone. And inside, a domestically produced 7nm chip, the Kirin 9000S, manufactured by SMIC, the Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation.
Wait, they did that in just 2 years? I remember industry analysts saying that was structurally impossible without access to the absolute cutting-edge lithography systems from ASML. That's a technological middle finger to the sanctions, isn't it?
It was an undeniable technological leap. And you're right about the time frame. For context, industry leaders like TSMC in Taiwan or Samsung in South Korea, they took maybe 3 to 5 years to reach the 7nm node with full access to the global supply chain and the most advanced tools.
The EUV machines.
Right, the extreme ultraviolet lithography systems made by the Dutch firm ASML. SMIC achieved this 7nm chip using less efficient, deep ultraviolet DUV lithography systems, which they'd managed to acquire before the most severe U.S. controls took effect. They couldn't get the state-of-the-art EUV systems.
Can you break down DUV versus EUV for us quickly? Why does that technical difference matter so much, and why was making a 7nm chip with DUV so remarkable?
Absolutely. It's essentially about the wavelength of light used to etch the circuits onto the silicon wafer. EUV uses extremely short wavelengths, like 13.5 nanometers. This allows manufacturers to draw incredibly fine lines, tiny transistors, in a single exposure pass. It's relatively fast, highly precise, and leads to high yields, meaning fewer defective chips.
Okay, so EUV is the gold standard for cutting edge.
It is. DUV, however, uses much longer wavelengths of light, typically 193 nanometers. To achieve the tiny 7nm feature size using DUV, SMIC had to resort to this really complex and expensive process called multi-patterning.
Multi-patterning.
Yeah, it means exposing the same area of the silicon wafer multiple times, maybe 3 or 4 times, using intricate masks and chemical treatments in between each exposure to gradually build up that fine pattern.
So they were basically taking an inefficient tool and forcing it to do a much more precise job by dramatically increasing the complexity and the number of manufacturing steps involved.
Exactly. And this inevitably results in much higher production costs. Significantly lower yields, meaning more chips per batch, are defective, and slower manufacturing times compared to using EUV. However, the critical point here is that they managed to bypass the technological barrier the U.S. tried to erect.
They found a workaround.
They found a very difficult, very expensive workaround, but they found one. The fact that they overcame that choke point and domestically produced a 7-nanometer chip sent a clear, tangible message. The bans won't necessarily stop progress. They will simply accelerate indigenous efforts, even if those efforts are initially less cost-efficient than, say, DeepSeek software optimization. This was defiance made concrete, etched in silicon.
And China's response to these controls wasn't just technical, it was also massively financial and strategic, right? Doubling down on huge state funding and strategic stockpiling.
Oh, the state-backed financial response was immediate and just overwhelming. The National Circuit Industry Investment Fund, known as the Big Fund, had already been established, raising about $21 billion initially. But then, in direct response to the tightening export controls, the PRC injected an additional $40 billion in 2023.
$40 billion. More.
Specifically earmarked to bolster the domestic semiconductor industry and secure its entire supply chain, from materials to design to manufacturing. And it wasn't just money. The government implemented clear policies prohibiting the use of CPUs made by U.S. companies like Intel and AMD for Chinese government PCs and servers.
Creating a guaranteed market for domestic alternatives.
Precisely. Approving domestic alternatives like Lunsen and Fidium.
Yeah.
They are actively creating a captive domestic market to ensure their own chip companies have the financial runway and the demand needed to develop and scale up.
The ultimate goal here isn't just one 7-nanometer chip, though. It's this long road to autarky, right? Complete self-reliance. This seems encapsulated in that broader strategy, Made in China 2025.
Yeah, the ambition is total technological sovereignty in critical areas, including building its own full GPU pipeline, designing and manufacturing their own high-performance chips for AI, which, as the sources suggest, is probably an ambitious 10 to 15-year project.
That goal seems to go beyond just economics. It feels almost existential for them, tied to national dignity, destiny.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
I heard this anecdote about a veteran manager, let's call him Mr. Chen, at a Chinese semiconductor equipment company. When the latest, most severe U.S. restrictions were announced, his younger engineers were, understandably, pretty depressed. They felt cut off from the global cutting edge.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But Mr. Chen apparently just gathered them and said something like, look, for 30 years we followed, we learned, we copied. Now they have finally shut the door completely. This is good. From today, we no longer follow. We build our own path.
Wow. That sentiment that the U.S. strategy essentially removed all ambiguity and forced the decision for complete independence, that's incredibly powerful, isn't it? It transforms the goal from just catching up to something more like destiny.
It completely reframes the entire competition. Industry veterans seem to view this 10 to 15-year project building a domestic autonomous GPU and chip pipeline as the final necessary step. A step that will inevitably reshape the entire global tech world.
However, it's crucial to maintain perspective here, right? Technological sovereignty is more like a spectrum, not an absolute switch you flip.
Absolutely. Despite these truly heroic efforts and the massive funding, China still relies heavily on foreign technology in certain critical areas. Especially for those advanced lithography systems, the EUV machines needed for sub-7-nanometer nodes. They haven't cracked that yet.
So they've been more successful at increasing the amount of made-in-China products, regardless of who owns the factory, than achieving absolute Chinese-made dominance by purely domestic firms.
That seems to be the case so far. The challenge remains massive, particularly at the absolute leading edge of manufacturing technology. But the political will, the national focus, and the capital backing this push are just unprecedented.
Okay, so we've covered innovation born from constraints, like the DeepSeek model. We've covered strategy driven by state funding and that cultural resilience, the Chiku. But where China really seems to demonstrate its structural competitive edge isn't just in the lab or the design phase, it's out there on the factory floor in the market. It's the strength of deployment over discovery.
Absolutely. This is a critical point. Frontier innovation. That groundbreaking knowledge creation, the initial discovery, is obviously vital. But China excels, truly excels, at the rapid and large-scale deployment of proven technologies.
They don't have to be the first to invent it.
Exactly. They specialize in being the first to deploy it at a scale that achieves immediate, massive economic productivity gains. And this deployment focus, honestly, often matters more for immediate competitive advantage than being the absolute first innovator. They prioritize transforming cutting-edge ideas wherever they come from into tangible integrated products and ensuring this incredibly high-speed transition from the lab to the market.
And we see this reflected most visibly in things like robotics and industrial automation. This is where the sheer scale metrics become just truly astonishing. They really speak to this efficiency paradigm.
The numbers are staggering. Let's look at 2024 estimates. China installed roughly 295,000 new industrial robots in its factories.
295,000 in 1 year.
In 1 year. That figure represents about 54% of global deployments. And it's nearly 10 times the U.S. total, which installed around 34,200 units.
10 times the U.S. installations.
Yeah. Furthermore, China's robot density, the number of robots per 10,000 employees, has now hit 470. That actually surpasses traditional automation leaders like Germany and Japan. They now operate well over 2 million active industrial robots, dominating something like 40% of the global robotics market.
And this rapid, widespread industrial automation must translate instantly into structural economic advantages, right? In cost, speed, quality of manufacturing.
Instantly. It's a fundamental shift to their productive capacity.
And beyond the factory floor, China has secured another huge structural competitive advantage through sheer supply chain dominance, particularly in electric vehicles, EVs, and the batteries that power them. This control seems to provide deep geopolitical leverage that the US and Europe are only now really starting to grapple with.
Oh, this control is absolutely critical because it extends far beyond just manufacturing the final EV product. It's about controlling the essential raw materials and the intermediate goods that are required globally for the entire green energy transition.
Okay, break that down.
So China produced about 62% of global EVs in 2022. That's impressive in itself. But look upstream at the components. Chinese manufacturers produce 75% of the world's lithium-ion batteries, and they account for about 77% of the global manufacturing capacity for those batteries.
3/4 of the world's batteries.
But the real power, the real structural choke point, lies in the refinement and processing bottleneck. It's not just about digging the raw materials out of the ground.
Mining is only the first step.
Correct. China utterly dominates the processing capacity. This is the high-cost, often high-polluting, but absolutely essential middle step in the supply chain. China refines something like 95% of the world's manganese, 70% of the world's cobalt and graphite, 67% of the world's lithium.
Wow, those numbers are huge.
And maybe most tellingly, China accounts for nearly 90% of the global capacity for cathode active materials. That's the core component that really determines a battery's performance, its energy density, its lifespan.
90%. That concentration of processing power gives them incredible geopolitical leverage, doesn't it? It can be deployed almost instantly. If a single country controls that level of critical mineral processing and intermediate goods manufacturing,
it gains a profound structural advantage. This advantage allows Chinese firms to access these key inputs at lower prices and much faster rates than competitors elsewhere. It grants them a kind of perpetual first-mover advantage in experimenting with new material combinations for batteries and then scaling up production instantly when something works.
which helps explain why their EV market matured so incredibly quickly. They effectively control the speed, the cost, and the availability of the foundational elements for the entire global energy transition.
Precisely. And this deployment strength, this ability to scale so fast, is facilitated by this unique, integrated ecosystem and speed of execution. It links the lab to the factory faster than pretty much anywhere else on Earth.
This integrated technology ecosystem sounds like another cornerstone of their cost efficiency. You hear these stories about cities like Shenzhen where they enable these rapid innovation cycles that just seem impossible elsewhere.
Indeed. The sources suggest that components for, say, a new robot, or almost any new electronic device, really, upstream or downstream parts, can often be sourced within an hour in places like Shenzhen's Huakangbei electronics market.
Within an hour.
That's the claim. This unparalleled supply chain proximity drastically reduces business costs, it minimizes R&D cycle times, and it just accelerates that transition from a theoretical concept on a whiteboard to an actual product being deployed in the market. Western companies might spend 6 months waiting for specialty components to arrive. In this ecosystem, they're often available almost immediately off the shelf or quickly manufactured nearby.
And that incredible speed is underpinned by fundamental infrastructure decisions made at the national level, isn't it?
Precisely. You can't separate the ecosystem speed from the infrastructure. China's massive sustained investments in roads, ports, high-speed rail, ubiquitous 5G networks, specialized computing capacity, All of this serves as the essential foundation for technology deployment at scale. It's that pave the road to riches approach, but for technology diffusion.
It creates the rails for innovation to run on.
Exactly. It's a prerequisite. It ensures that when they develop an AI model as efficient as DeepSeek's, they have the infrastructure ready to instantly integrate it across thousands of factories, businesses, services. This is what that AI Plus initiative is all about, aiming for 90% AI integration across the economy by 2030. They're aiming for penetration rates of intelligent terminals exceeding 90% by that time. They don't just innovate, they industrialize innovation almost instantly.
So we started this deep dive with that stunning number, didn't we? The $294,000 training cost for DeepSeek R1. A figure that's really framed our entire discussion today. And what we've explored, it seems, isn't just a technological rivalry or even just an economic one. It feels more like a conflict between two fundamentally different ways of approaching technology, capital, society itself.
It really is a profound clash of philosophies, I think. On one side, you have the Western model, which, broadly speaking, champions individual brilliance, decentralized innovation, often fueled by private financial power, looking for those quarterly returns. And historically, the pursuit of maximum performance, often at maximum cost, that burn rate mentality we talked about.
Right, scale at any price.
And on the other side, you have the Chinese model we've discussed, characterized by this sense of collective mission, industrial momentum backed by long-term patient state capital, and this relentless pursuit of maximum efficiency, often driven by strategic constraints, perfectly exemplified by the startling cost efficiency of that DeepSeek model.
Maximum performance versus maximum efficiency, financial power versus industrial momentum, individual brilliance versus collective mission.
That sums it up pretty well. But what makes this rivalry so incredibly complex and frankly so unstable is the uncomfortable reality that despite being rivals, locked in this intense competition, they're also profoundly codependent.
Yeah, they're locked in this complex economic embrace they can't easily escape.
They absolutely are. We can't ignore the fact that the U.S. still holds significant leads in foundational chip architecture in some areas of frontier AI research. But at the same time, the U.S. is fundamentally reliant on Chinese-dominated supply chains for critical rare earth elements and other materials essential for its own advanced technology.
We're talking about things needed for smartphones, EV batteries.
And high-end defense systems, F-35 jets, missile guidance components. They rely on materials processed, refined, and often manufactured into intermediate components in China. China provides core materials and, increasingly, the manufacturing intelligence. So neither side can simply decouple or wall off the other without suffering immense, perhaps crippling economic and strategic pain.
The world's two largest technological empires rely on each other to keep their respective cutting edges sharp. It's quite a paradox.
It is. So if the goal is technological leadership, the metrics themselves are changing too fast for those traditional scale-based strategies to hold up indefinitely. That efficiency advantage demonstrated by DeepSeek, that's perhaps the most disruptive breakthrough of all.
Because it changes the economics fundamentally.
The big takeaway, I think, from the DeepSeek disruption is that the timelines for global technological diffusion are being dramatically compressed. DeepSeek's efficiency breakthroughs demonstrate that high performance in AI is no longer exclusively gated by having access to billions in capital and only the very latest hardware.
A determined, smart engineering team can get there another way.
If a determined engineering team can achieve comparable results with a tiny fraction of the budget, the innovation cycle accelerates globally. And that perceived U.S. advantage, based largely on financial scale, well, it may erode much faster than many people anticipated. The competition is shifting. It's no longer just about who can innovate first. It's increasingly about who can deploy the necessary technology the fastest and, crucially, the most affordably.
So the global power structure is rearranging itself based on these new metrics. Efficiency, control over the means of production, not just control over frontier innovation.
That seems to be the direction things are heading. If the U.S. perhaps still holds some keys to the future through foundational research, and China increasingly controls the factory floor, the means of production and deployment at scale, then the real conflict isn't just about who wins the next AI model race.
What is it then?
It's whether the inherent stability of the global system can actually survive having these two empires, so structurally and culturally opposed in many ways, yet utterly unable to afford letting go of each other.